It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. With real excitement and genuine pleasure, remind you all that it was 14 short years ago on this day in this room that Russell George at our seminar announced that then he was director of the Department of Natural Resources and said, you know, what Colorado needs is a grassroots effort to put together a cohesive water plan, one that's built around the needs of the individual basins, but is coordinated in a way that makes sense and for which the state can provide resource and leadership for implementation and fulfillment of those plans. Today, we have a Colorado water plan. So we have the father of that water plan. We have the father of House Bill 1177, the instigator, the brain trust for that effort. Now to having birthed that process, having resulted in an adolescent, if that's where we are in Colorado's water plan, we have a parent here to talk about the hopes and fears of where that adolescent is going and how he or she's maturing. Russell this week also, if you didn't read it in the paper yesterday, on Wednesday, the Governor Hickenlooper announced that Russell is being recognized for his tremendous contributions in public and community service with the governor's, let me get it right, the Governor's Citizenship Medal. Which is really an enormous honor and a well-deserved recognition. The governor said Russell George represents what it means to be a public servant. A cabinet member under two governors of two different parties, currently serving as the Colorado River Mainstem's Water Conservation Board director, many other services that he has provided over the years, but most importantly to me, he's been a friend and a mentor, and he has been the same for the entire water community. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Russell George for joining us today.
So the thickest part of this library is my speech. So one of the advantages of being first is that if you do it right, you can be last as well. Risky business. Risky business, particularly on the big river, the great Colorado River. Risky business. So what does that mean? Well, I've always understood risky to mean something bad could happen. But there's also another view that's risk, and we all know that some risks are worth taking. So we don't necessarily have to define risky business as that there's going to be something bad happening. It could be, no, if we do our business right, the risk will be good and worth taking. So that's kind of the tone I'm going to talk about today, is that other side of risky business. So my own experience with the concept, particularly in relating to the Colorado River, started with my father, who had an irrigated farm between Rifle and Silt, had an 1887 water right out of the Colorado River, and made me irrigate with him. But one of the nice things about him is that he would always talk while we worked. And so when we'd be out irrigating, I'd be asking questions, but I'd mostly be listening. And he oftentimes was talking about risk. risk of loss, risk of someone taking his water. And of course, I'd want to know who and how could this be? And some days the risk came from the east. And in those days, at least with him, that risk was the activities of the Denver Water Department. But on other days, the risk was actually from the west. And his concern was he'd been to California, and he knew what was happening out there, how fast it was growing, how much money there appeared to be. And he was pretty sure that if Denver didn't take his ditch water, California would. So that was the risky business that I started worrying about and all those years ago. And in those days, of course, the way water decisions was made was sort of different than we see today. Most decisions were made in cities, in boardrooms, in banks, bank rooms, made by people with power, and probably by people with money. And so water then became that traditional cliche, water will flow towards money. And it was largely true. There was nothing particularly wrong about that. When people settled their farms to irrigate, they had the economy in mind. It was defined as survival, but it was for the same purpose. It was to serve family or friends somehow to earn a living. And that is true for probably large and small water users. Well, as time went on and I began to look at ways that I could get into the big picture, I ended up as a freshman in legislature 25 years ago. I'm going to ask you to bring me a glass of water, would you please? I should have done that when I walked up here, except for my library, I guess. So 25 years ago, got to legislature, and I learned something that I hadn't understood before, that thank you, Chris. Every rookie Western Slope legislator had to go through a specific rite of passage in the legislature. Every one of us was obligated to write and then get passed the best, most brilliant, original Basin of Origin Protection bill. And so I wanted to take my position and duty seriously, so I thought, I can do that. I'm bright, I'm good, I can pass the best Basin of Origin bill that anybody can. Well, of course, as you know, the joke was on me. But that was the standard way the Western Slope looked at the water issues, at least in legislature. We have to protect ourselves from those who would take our water. And so Basin of Origin was always the battle cry, and it was seen as a battle. So that's 25 years ago. So now if we'll roll forward, we begin to see that change has occurred, and we ask ourselves, why? What happened? Well, I think why and what happened was most dramatic in 2002. Now, 2002, I think, by many measurements, was the worst drought that we'd seen in Colorado for a long time. Maybe not in history. I don't remember that terminology being used in 2002, that it's the worst drought in history. But it had been building, it got everybody's attention, and it was bad. But what we learned, and maybe we should have realized this long before, but remember, for maybe the 100 years before 2002, there had been a lot more moisture, more rainfall, more snow, all through Colorado than we saw that we see in current times. So we are all creatures of habit. If the habit is that we have plenty, that's how we conduct our behaviors. So we had good systems in place for managing plenty for that 100 years or so while we were settling the rural parts of Colorado. Hadn't had to really think about or do much about dealing with less than plenty. 2002 hit us pretty hard in that respect. We realized, particularly from the government side, we didn't have a lot of structure in place to do that. I suspect, though I wasn't involved much in those days, the 7 basin states were scratching that same point on their collective head. How about that? So I think that really was the main factor in getting us to begin to think about something besides we'll have plenty and we'll get by and we can keep doing things the same old way. Something else a lot more subtle happened in those days, in my opinion, that there was something going on in culture all across the country, and certainly in Colorado, and I think to a large extent here at home. And that subtle shift was in the attitudes of ordinary people about how much freedom they had to make choices for themselves, or how much did they have to take what those in power gave them. There was this concept of collaboration sort of growing without anyone paying a lot of attention to it. Wherever you'd go, you'd begin to hear people coming to the meeting saying, but wait a minute, I want to be heard. I want to have something to say about that. So some of us who were really expected to begin to solve these issues wondered, gosh, is there some way we can put all of this together? Well, there was, happily. In 2003, you can't see this, but I'll tell you what it is. I told you it was a library. Well, this is a book. This is the biography of Delph Carpenter, Silver Fox of the Rockies, published 2003. Professor Dan Tyler had been working for a number of years in the family papers, business papers of Delph Carpenter, and wanted to tell the story. And of course, it's the story of a very brilliant and visionary water attorney, but it was a lot more than that, because part of his legacy, maybe the key to his legacy, was his understanding of why we needed state compacts, and that the United States Constitution under the Compact Clause actually allowed and encouraged that. Hadn't been used for some reason anywhere. And he got caught in the concept of not Colorado, just because it's the headwater state, can't be sure that it gets the first draw and first call on everything that arises, all the water that arises in Colorado. United States Supreme Court said, you're wrong about that. And he too then, even though he was a bit earlier in time than my dad, he too had this concern about what was happening to the economy and the demography of California. And he became very alarmed in his official position as Commissioner of Water in Colorado that he couldn't protect Colorado by litigation, which even in those days was the way you ultimately made decisions and water decisions, and of course it continued up until that time in history to be the main arbiter of water decisions. He knew that if Colorado, as a small, slower growing state, intended to protect itself, litigation was not going to be the best way. In fact, he thought that was probably the riskiest way. So what he did is that he developed a technique of how to negotiate what Colorado needed. And the book really lays this out as a model, really. And it's in the water subject, and it's in the subject matter of Western Water Compacts, several others than just the Colorado River. But it mainly focuses on the one that matters to us in this conversation today. And so he set out this pattern that was, look, I need to understand what it is that my opponent wants. And once I figure that out, and I give him the benefit of the doubt, and I begin to find common ground, he is more likely then to hear me out and understand my situation. And so he put all of that into practice, and ultimately probably that was the main factor that succeeded on an absolutely impossible task. And that was bringing these 7 states together way back before the battles had really gotten serious, and were willing to look into the future and agree and help everybody to succeed. So it was that magic, if you will, that began to form in the minds of some of us that were trying to do the same thing, but just for the state, Colorado. Sometime in, I think, spring of 2004, I went to a water conference. A friend of mine named Peter Nichols was presenting in one of the seminars like we have this afternoon. And his conclusion, after he'd worked through some cases and case studies, he said, maybe it's time for these east slope, west slope issues to be resolved in a compact process like the Colorado River Compact. And I thought, okay. So I went up after the session. I said, I'm buying you lunch. And so he and I took that crazy idea of a compact conversation and negotiation as the right way to begin to settle some of these water issues. And the rest of it, I think, is history that you all know. By that fall, as Chris reminded us, I was invited to come to your predecessors in this gathering. He said it in a different way than I remember it. I came and asked for help because I didn't want to be the only one standing if this idea failed. Happily, I had misjudged the risk on that one. By 2005, legislature was ready, was poised. We had Jim Isgar in the Senate, Josh Penry in the House, very able and eager legislators. We built a staff at DNR. Governor Owens was totally committed to the concept, did everything in his power to help it go forward, and it did. And I don't want to ever mislead you to say that everybody liked it from the beginning, quite the opposite. Most of the larger interests were skeptical, and so we invited them to help us write the bill so they would accept it, which of course they did. And it made the bill better, and it made it be acceptable so that it could succeed. And so we end up with House Bill 1177, and we began the tour. And the whole concept here was, for the first time, we're going to have water decisions made by people all across the countryside, people where the decisions are most affected. Empower people out in the basins, at home, using water for their livelihood and survival, and they can share in the decisions. And so the Roundtables formed, and many of you have served and are now serving on the Roundtables. And here we are all these years later willing to say we've been successful. And the only reason that can be said is because you folks at home said, this will work. We can make this work. And what we had done was said, if you're willing to put in the time, we'll just have you, we'll ask you to answer 2 questions, and we'll help you to do something about the answers to the questions. We asked everybody in your basin, study out and tell us what you need to protect your water future. And then we'll try to find state resources and other resources to help you do that. In those days, severance tax was generating pretty good revenue stream, so we were able to begin to move some real money into these basins to do the projects that mattered. In these years since we started that in 2006 probably, about $86 million has been invested in these programs and projects. All of that because the people at home found the interest and the willingness to be able to share with their friends and neighbors in making the decisions and in making things better for their communities. So what we were finding is that you had a lot of things happening in the basins, but we weren't getting where we needed to be on the whole state. And really, remember, one of the main goals was we're trying to crack that nut about east versus west. Or as the folks in the Rio Grande Basin say, north and south. Well, actually south and north. And then our friends in Walden would say, no, just north. So it isn't just east and west. It's meant for all of it. But we hadn't really found a way to get to that, breaching the divide. Enter Governor John Hickenlooper and said to the people of Colorado, and particularly the Colorado Water Conservation Board, it's time for a Colorado water plan. The staff at CWCB probably didn't know what had just hit them when that started. But they rose to the occasion, and all of you and your friends and neighbors all across the state got up and got to work, and we created Colorado's water plan. Now, I brought this just in case you hadn't seen it. There it is. I won't tell you. I take it everywhere I go because I have an iPad now. But this represents, this isn't the water plan. The water plan is out on the ground where you live and work and use your water. But the ideas are here that we've all had over the years. We tried to reach out and be as comprehensive as we possibly could and get it into this plan and try to meld it into a meaningful plan for the future. And so we treated it not like a novel, but like a textbook, or if you're a lawyer, a case book, or if you're a scholar, like an encyclopedia. And we tried to have reference to every known set of data or a document relating to Colorado water, and it's footnoted here. It's not here, but because of the beauty of computers, it's out there where we can get it. And so the idea was so that any of us, anywhere, could get the same information, study it ourselves, form our own conclusions, and weigh in on equal footing with anybody else to be able to argue for a position based upon the truth and based upon facts. And it's turned out it already has 2 years of wearing time, and I think it's wearing beautifully. And thanks to CWCB staff, we try to remember always to thank them for leading that Herculean effort to create a great product. So here it is. I urge you to continue to work with it and use it. I urge you to continue with the roundtables, because really the risky business has just begun. Now, like 2002, here we sit on the precipice, And it's not of our own making. That's the key thing. We always need to sort out those things that we're responsible for and that we can control or we caused, and those things that we didn't cause and can't control. And so the drought of 2018 now is sort of the poster monster of what can happen to a society from a place they didn't cause or can't control. And now we hear things like this is the worst drought in history. Now, history has to be defined. We have recorded history of only a few decades. We have tree rings for a few millennia, I guess. But even that we'd start talking like that is cause for enormous concern. Now, what happens when we have a concern? Most of us become afraid. And when we become afraid, we begin to follow our instincts. And our instincts are to pull back, to circle the wagons, that we'd like to say. But it also means that we're inclined to revert back to our old ways of doing things, old times when we were more comfortable and less fearful. The risk of that is that we'll then forget everything that we learned about getting along and collaborating and working together and sharing and treating each other fairly. But I think it's human enough that it's happening again. And I've seen it just ripple at a couple different times this year, different groups that had some competition for water quantity at stake. And even though we'd probably stage the conversation and the discussion either according to the roundtable process or according to the water plan process and goals, and then just as about we'd get to where we're going to start having that real conversation, I see this little bounce. And I think, wow, what was that? It was that fear and that pulling back. Instead of, at the time you need it most, reaching around to your ally, your friend, and say, okay, this is going to be harder than we thought, but we know how to get along and how to work together, and that's what we need to do. That's it. It's that simple. We didn't cause what's happening to the river. And we can't force Mother Nature to give us what we're lacking. But we can do everything else, and we can do it together better than doing it by pulling back and fighting it. So my whole purpose here today is to show us there's a positive side to all of this. We are all trusting people. We are trusting because we're trustworthy. And we should be more than willing to say so. And we should trust the people we're doing business with. Because if we'll trust them, they'll trust us. And it's that trust that this guy was talking about. And if he can get the people in those 7 states 100 years ago to trust each other and do something as monumental as the Colorado River Compact, we can do it today. We can do it between the east slope and the west slope. We can do it with our neighbors down the river. It's a positive, it's a good thing, it can be done, and we'll all be better for it. If we fail to do that at this juncture, we will fail everywhere. Think about it. Think about the economic displacement that will occur if we don't stay together during this time of shortage. We cannot be making decisions separately that help me and hurt you. If we do that, we're done. So it's that serious. The risk is that high. But remember, I started by saying there's a positive side to risk. I believe we can take that risk head on, stick together, help each other, use all of our tools, and we can succeed. So that's my challenge to you. Let's go forth and do it. Thank you very much.